Chervinsky. I'm the Executive Director at the George Washington Presidential Library. Do we have any first-time visitors to Mount Vernon? I love seeing first-time hands. Thank you so much and welcome. That is very exciting. I would like to thank tonight the Ford Motor Company, who generously supports this book series. Without their support, it would be much harder for us to bring phenomenal authors like the one tonight and to welcome you all. So we are very grateful for their support. And if you are thinking about planning your second visit, or perhaps your 102nd visit, I have a couple of suggestions for you in the coming weeks. So on November 18th, our monthly Lunch at the Library series is going to be in partnership with Gunston Hall and their senior curator and head of collections, Kate Steyer, because they have a recently discovered letter between George Mason and George Washington that was unpublished in the Washington's Papers Project. We didn't know about it. And so they are going to be bringing it to the library, and we will also be pulling out some of our materials to have a discussion about this very pivotal friendship and correspondence. Our next Ford Evening Book Talk, and those are always free, is on December 16th with Lauren Duvall on her book, The Homefront: Revolutionary Households, Military Occupation, and the Making of American Independence. So what did it look like to live in a space that was the American Revolution? For tonight's program, we will have a QR code on the screen. For those of you who have not used this system, it is how we encourage all of you to be a part of the conversation. If you take out your phone and open your camera app, it will automatically take you to a website where you can enter questions at any point throughout the evening. Please feel free to do so as soon as the question comes to mind, and we will either fold them into the conversation or I will get to them at the end. We very much like to know what you want to know about and to be able to give you that information. So with all of those logistics out of the way, I would now like to introduce our guest speaker this evening. I will be in conversation with Jeff Rosen, who is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, where he hosts We the People, a weekly podcast on constitutional debate. He's also professor of law at the George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor at The Atlantic. He's a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, and Yale Law School. And somehow, on top of all of that, he is the author of 9 books. I'm trying to write a book right now. I don't know how he does this. It is insane to me. You're going to have to give me tips. He is the author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestsellers, The Pursuit of Happiness and Conversations with RBG. His essays and commentaries have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, on NPR, in the New Republic, where he was a legal affairs editor, and in the New Yorker, where he has been a staff writer. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Rosen. We're on here. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here. I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you. I am such a fan of the work that you all do at the National Constitution Center, and for those of you who haven't been, you must go. It is a truly outstanding place, and even if you just go into the signers hall, I feel like that's worth the trip and worth the admission, but it has so much to offer, and I think you've really been a truly visionary leader of the center. So this is really a great honor for me.
Well, I am so honored and excited to be here as well. Just feeling the spirit of union here at Mount Vernon is always such an invigorating and inspiring experience. Your leadership here has been so meaningful, and I'm so excited about our work together for A250. And why don't we just jump in before we talk about the book? So Lindsay Chervinsky is one of the great historians who's contributed to an amazing new civic toolkit that the National Constitution Center has just launched for America 250. And it includes Lindsay and Robbie George on liberty, Gordon Wood on government by consent, Danielle Allen on equality. Akhil Amar has annotated the entire Declaration of Independence, clause by clause. Carol Birkin has biographies of the founders. It's all online, and it'll be a paperback by Simon & Schuster in May. And we're going to travel around the country talking about the American idea with great historians of different perspectives. So it's just such a meaningful way to really learn about history for A250, and I can't wait for our work together.
Me too, and I'm so honored to be included. You know, what started as a writing project, they then made into these incredible videos. And I will confess, maybe it is the sap in me or the patriot or something, but when you sent me the video, I got teary. Like, they're such powerful videos, and they're so compelling.
They're incredibly compelling, and it's because they're rooted in the primary texts, and it is so inspiring to hear the words of the founders and their commitment to the ideals of liberty, equality, and government by consent, and their debates over those words, and the ultimately powerful message and a reminder, which is also the message of this book, that although Americans have fought vigorously about how to balance those ideals from the beginning, they've been committed to the ideals themselves, and it's those ideals that have carried us through the toughest times.
Well, that provides a wonderful segue, but before I forget, where can people find the Civil Toolkit online?
National Constitution Center, Civic Toolkit, A250, just Google Civic Toolkit and you'll find it right away. And you'll find the interactive declaration, and you'll find the interactive Constitution, which is the core of all of our educational material, which, if you haven't checked this out, it'll blow your mind. It's America's greatest legal historians and scholars of different perspectives, writing about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. So you can find Justice Barrett and Neil Katyal agreeing and disagreeing about the meaning of the habeas corpus clause, and there are 80 clauses and 160 scholars. It's just a really inspiring modeling of deep civil dialogue and debate about every clause of the Constitution, and you've got to check it out.
Please do. Well, you mentioned the disagreement there, and I think that's such an important point, because sometimes talking heads will say, the founders thought that. And usually I say that is a sign that whatever they're going to say next is hogwash. Because the founders rarely agreed on anything. I would say they agreed on Washington as the first president. They agreed on no kings, and for the most part, and that's about it. So, could you lay out, as a starting point, sort of what are the two world visions that come to a clash here in this book and come to a clash later in American history?
You're so right that the two world visions of Hamilton and Jefferson fundamentally disagreed about the following big topics: national power versus states' rights, executive power versus judicial power, democracy versus rule by elites, and liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution. And on all of those questions, they had fundamentally different ideas about the relationship between liberty and power. For Jefferson, every increase in power threatens liberty. Hamilton comes to think that increases in power can secure liberty. And this leads to their basic disagreement about the fundamental political clash in the early republic involving the Bank of the United States, and it's defined all of our political conflicts ever since.
So you have this amazing visual to help us understand how these two work, and you describe it as the gold and silver threads. Can you explain what that means and why it's a helpful way for us to understand them?
It was just an image that came to my mind because Hamilton and Jefferson's ideas are indeed threads woven throughout the tapestry of American history. And sometimes they pull apart, and sometimes they cross, and sometimes they're so tightly wound that they threaten to snap. But it's the productive tension between the threads that sustains the American idea. And on the rare occasions when extremists have rejected that productive tension entirely, that's when the shooting begins.
Well, let's start with the sort of infamous event that kicks off this relationship, this very tempestuous relationship. And that is a dinner, not the dinner made famous by the Hamilton musical, the other dinner. So can you tell us a little bit about this dinner and what does it produce?
It's also in the room where it happened, which is not Independence Hall, but Jefferson's house in New York. I just gave the Liberty Medal to Ron Chernow at the Constitution Center, an incredible honor, and the Hamilton musical. And I started off by saying, you can see the Independence Hall from the NCC. I said, let's gaze at the room where it happened. And then I realized that's not the room where that happened. It was a dinner party in Manhattan that the musical had memorialized. But it's Jefferson's house and Washington's away. So the cabinet is gathered to discuss important business. And at some point in this dinner, Hamilton looks around the room and says to Jefferson, "Who are those three portraits on the wall?" And Jefferson said, "Those are my three visions of the greatest men in history: John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." And Hamilton pauses for a long time and then blurts out, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." And then Jefferson scribbles in his diary, "This proves that Hamilton's not only for a monarchy, but a monarchy bottomed on corruption." And then he goes on to found the Democratic Republican Party in opposition to the supposed Caesaristic and monarchical ambitions of Hamilton and the Federalists. And he calls them the monocrats, and he accuses them of conspiring to resurrect not only monarchy in America, but conspiring to subvert democracy and consolidate power in an authoritarian dictatorship. That's the party slogan of the Democrats for about 150 years. And what's so striking about this dinner is that Hamilton was almost certainly joking. As Ron Chernow says, he feared a Caesar as much as Jefferson, but he feared that the Caesar would come from below by flattering the mob like a demagogue rather than above. And he writes in Federalist 21, "Imagine that Shays' rebellion in western Massachusetts had been led by a Catiline or a Caesar. The Republican might have been strangled in its cradle." Hamilton's solution to preventing a Caesar is a life term for the presidency. Indeed. He stands up in the Constitutional Convention in that notorious speech on June 19th. He talks for 6 hours and says the only thing that will sustain the republic is a president elected for life. Some of the delegates gasp, others support it. Gouverneur Morris and James Madison supported a life term for the president at different times, so it wasn't completely off the table for the more Federalist side. But Hamilton thinks a life term will spare the president the urge to turn himself into a demagogue and tempt the people with bread and circuses and call off elections. Jefferson also fears a Caesar, but from above rather than below. He imagines a military would-be dictator who will cross the Rubicon and subvert the Senate and consolidate all power in his own hands. And when he gets a copy of the Constitution for the first time, he says to Madison, "I have two objections. One, there's no Bill of Rights. And two, the president is eligible for re-election." And he fears that because of this, a future president might, quote, "lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, enlist the states who support him, and refuse to leave office." That was what Jefferson feared. Jefferson's solution is the opposite of Hamilton. He wants a one-year term limit for the president, so the president won't be tempted to extend his term. In the end, the convention chooses no term limits, and for the next 250 years, citizens have been debating, has the president become a Caesar? The question we're debating today is the same essential question about executive power that dates back to that dinner. And Andrew Jackson is attacked as King Andrew, and the two-term limit sticks. Jefferson affirms Washington's noble decision to step down like Cincinnatus. Jefferson also steps down. For about 70 years, no one tries to run again. Then Grant wants to run in 1875. The Senate passes a resolution saying, let's stick to the two-term limit. Theodore Roosevelt runs for a third term, having pledged not to, and loses. Then Franklin Roosevelt is attacked as Julius Caesar so often that he dresses up like Julius Caesar for his birthday in 1934, and he wears the laurel, and Eleanor dresses up like a Roman matron, and the aides are all centurions, and he kind of makes sport of it. But after his third and then fourth term, he dies after 87 days, and then Republicans take the Senate and they propose and ratify the 22nd Amendment in 1951 to prevent a Caesar. The idea is that you can't have a president who's overstaying his term, and they invoke Washington as their model. So the questions we are discussing today, first, are there loopholes in the 22nd Amendment? And maybe it's just worth flagging what the loophole is. The 22nd Amendment says you can't be twice elected president, but it doesn't prevent a president who has been elected twice from running as vice president for someone else and then having that elected president step down and having the former president succeed him. except the 12th Amendment might be a barrier because it says you can only run for vice president if you're eligible to the office of vice presidency. Some suggest if you can't be elected, you're not eligible. Others think that eligibility is just the age limits, and if you secede by resignation, then you're not being elected. What will happen, who knows? And our president last week said the loophole was too cute, so perhaps the tradition will stand. But it all goes back to these fundamental fears of Caesarism and the questions we're discussing today about, has too much power been concentrated in the executive branch? Is Congress doing its job? Is the judiciary too sympathetic to executive power? All go back to that dinner.
Okay, there are a lot of threads I need to, pun intended,
Yeah,
not intended,
yes.
but there are a lot of threads I want to pull from that. So my first question is, the great Joanne Freeman says that the way to understand Thomas Jefferson is to know that sometimes he lies. Because sometimes the only way to make sense of him is that he lies. Doesn't mean he's not brilliant, doesn't mean he's not super important, but just sometimes he lies. I have a hard time believing that Alexander Hamilton wouldn't know what a portrait of John Locke looked like. I have a hard time believing he wouldn't know what Francis Bacon would look like. So I'm immediately a little skeptical about this story. How much credence do you put behind it? And how much of it, I mean, I said earlier to you, Jefferson is one of the all-time greatest propagandists in American history.
Yes.
So how much of this is him coming up with a good story?
Great point, and he might well have made it up. It's decades later, it's in his Anas. He adds also the detail that John Adams had said, purge the British Constitution of its corruption and it would achieve perfection, and Hamilton supposedly blurted out, purge it of its corruption, you would lose what makes it perfect. In fact, with its corruption, it is most perfect. Jefferson surely knew that Hamilton was referring to corruption in the sense that David Hume used it, because everyone quoted Hume at the convention in terms of the executive getting influence and loyalty from the parliament or legislature, not from financial corruption. But the main thing is the point that you just made so well. Jefferson is founding a political party on the greatest conspiracy theory in American history. So he just knew what would sell, and he never failed to accuse Hamilton of conspiring to resurrect monarchy long after it was obvious that he forswore it. Now, on the other hand, what makes it a really interesting story is that Hamilton did muse with the idea of leading a military coup and had conspired. He always dreamt of leading a filibuster to Spanish Louisiana and possibly seizing lands held by Spain. And in the end, Aaron Burr, of course, was rightly accused by Hamilton and Jefferson of doing precisely that, except to foment a secession movement in Spanish Louisiana. So Hamilton may have been musing about a version of what he accused Burr of doing. And Gouverneur Morris, Hamilton's Federalist ally, if not friend, in his eulogy for Hamilton, suggested that he was never sure whether Hamilton had abandoned his hobby of imagining that there might be so much civil disruption that some kind of military intervention would be necessary. So Hamilton may not have fully resolved it even to himself. He wasn't exotic here. Other Federalists toyed with the idea of a life term and a really strong executive. Whatever was in Hamilton's mind, Jefferson was running with the conspiracy theory. But since we're here at Mount Vernon, doesn't this all the more show how indispensable Washington's self-abnegation was? Without his wise determination to step down like Cincinnatus, he could have easily made himself a Caesar. He would have been acclaimed as such. He could have made himself a Caesar at Newburgh when the soldiers were going to rebel, and instead he plead for patience and took out his reading glasses and appealed to the soldiers' virtue. So it really reminds, and also, there'd never been a republic in history that hadn't fallen to demagogues and the mob, just as every monarchy had turned to tyranny and aristocracy to oligarchy. This was the Polybian cycle. Anacyclosis was the fancy name, and all previous pure, unmixed forms of government had deteriorated into their opposite. So that's why it was such a experiment, so untested, and genuine disagreement about exactly how to strike the balance between executive power and legislative power, which made all of their debates so important.
I want to dig in. You had mentioned this, that they both had fears of the system going awry. One sort of was a fear of the mob and one was a fear of the dictator. Can you just explain to us a little bit more how those are kind of two sides of the same coin?
They're deep students of ancient history, and every previous republic had fallen to demagogues or dictators. In a sense, both Hamilton and Jefferson were right, because the ancients knew that dictators could emerge from below or above. There is the demagogue Cleon in Greece, who tries to seduce the 6,000 person Athenian legislature into invading in the Peloponnesian War. And that's why Madison says, in the Federalist Papers, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. So there's very great fear of pure, unmixed democracy, and much of the Constitution is designed to avoid that kind of populist demagogue. But then there's Caesar himself, who starts off with popular support, crosses the Rubicon, and persuades the Senate to abandon its prerogatives and to stop doing its job and to cede authority to him as he buys off the people with bread and circuses, and in the end imposes his authority from above rather than below. So they're sophisticated students of history, and they're both looking at different sides of the same coin.
It's really helpful. So one of the things that I love so much about this book is, I get asked a lot about the flip-flopping of political parties over the many centuries. And we have like 4 versions of a Republican Party, and it seems like their kind of positions go back and forth, and it's very hard to trace them. They kind of look like a DNA helix thing. I think the best way to actually understand that is to trace Jefferson and Hamilton's fortunes, and you do so brilliantly. So could you kind of walk us through the roller coaster that is their popularity and their agenda from the time they die, basically, up until today?
A double helix something is a great metaphor, but let's just follow their changing fortunes. And as David Wallstreicher says, they're like goods on the stock market, and when one goes up, the other goes down. So Hamilton dies in the duel, and his fortunes are low. He's the discredited would-be monarchist, and he's got no juice. And in the beginning of the era of good feeling, everyone's a Jeffersonian. And Henry Clay founds the Whig Party, which was the successor of the Old Federalists, on Hamiltonian principles. He invokes Hamilton's idea of an American system, which would have national regulation of the economy. But Jefferson is his patron saint. He studied with George Wythe, Jefferson's law tutor, and he's a nationalist Republican who invokes Jefferson as his hero. Then you have the unbelievable crisscrossing of John Calhoun, who's John Quincy Adams' vice president, then switches to Jackson, starts as a nationalist, then becomes a states' rights guy, all to defend slavery, and finally rejects the Declaration as a self-evident lie and says slavery is a positive good. Then you have Lincoln. And Lincoln, you'd think, would be a Hamilton guy because he believes in the American system and in strong national power, but his mentor is Henry Clay. So he first, in 1859, says, all honor to Jefferson, who had the shining ability to recognize the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, and he invokes Jefferson to end slavery. He stands in front of Independence Hall and says, I've never had a thought politically that didn't stem from the Declaration. I'd rather be assassinated on this spot than abandon the principles of Jefferson. So Lincoln reinvents Jefferson into the prophet of natural equality. Then, after the Civil War, Jefferson's toast, because he's the states' rights secession guy who defended nullification and destroyed the Union. So Grant is in the White House. He banishes a statue of Jefferson, which President Polk had brought to the White House, back to disgrace in the basement of the Capitol, and a statue of Hamilton's put in the middle of the rotunda. And then James Garfield leads a Hamilton revival after reading the collected works of Alexander Hamilton, which have just been published by his son. And he makes Hamilton the patron saint of Reconstruction and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and strong national power to enforce civil rights. Then the Gilded, I'm going to finish this, but we'll just do all of American history
No,
through
it's
Hamilton
good.
and
Do it
Jefferson.
all at once, then we'll dig into
Do you
some
want more?
moments.
Okay.
It's great.
But there's more. Okay, so we're up to the Gilded Age, the amazing election of 1912. All three guys are fans of Hamilton who've written biographies of Hamilton or Hamilton-adjacent people. So Theodore,
insane.
listen to this. This is so amazing. Theodore Roosevelt, first of all, wrote a biography of Gouverneur Morris and says that Hamilton is the greatest American.
As a
of that
side note,
age.
we have to be careful to not get Jeffrey on a Gouverneur Morris tangent because I listened to some. It was at your conversation I'm digressing, but
No.
your conversation at the National Constitution Center with Jeffrey Goldberg. I was in stitches. I was laughing so hard over your conversation about Gouverneur and then his comments. It's highly worth a listen.
We just got talking about the Gouv before the show, and we couldn't stop.
He's the most
it's a sideline.
ridiculous character in early American history.
I'm not going to start now, but he is
Okay.
going to be a central character in my next book, actually, The Pursuit of
Excellent.
Union. So.
Okay.
But back to our regularly scheduled programming in the Progressive era. Theodore Roosevelt writes a Gouverneur Morris biography. Then he reads a biography of a fictionalized novel about Hamilton called The Conqueror, being the true and romantic story of Alexander Hamilton by a woman named Gertrude Atherton. This is the Hamilton musical of its day. It's an international bestseller. Then Theodore Roosevelt reads Herbert Croly's Promise of the American Life, which calls on him to deploy Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends, the Hamiltonian means of strong federal power to achieve the Jeffersonian ends of curbing the corporations and the trusts. And he adopts that idea in his new nationalism speech and says, I am a Hamiltonian on executive power and Jeffersonian on democracy. Then there's his opponent, Woodrow Wilson, who, although a Jeffersonian Democrat, is a fan of Hamilton, criticizes the separation of powers, and views Hamilton and Hegel as the great defenders of a strong executive. And in number 3 place, William Howard Taft, the old constitutionalist, who worships or reveres Marshall and Hamilton and is fighting the election to defend Hamiltonian strong federal courts as a check on 2 presidents that he thinks are turning the presidency into demagogues and a populist office. So Wilson wins. We're almost there. Then Hamilton is running high, and all the Coolidge and Harding are painting him as the prophet of American capitalism. Then 1929, the stock market crash, boom, he's in the doghouse again. Then Franklin Roosevelt reads another biography of Hamilton and Jefferson. It's called Jefferson versus Hamilton, Democracy versus Aristocracy, by a guy called Claude Bowers, who's a journalist as well as a defender of the Dunning School of Reconstruction. And FDR invites him to speak to the Democratic Convention in 1928. And he gives this speech to millions of people on the radio saying, we've got to resurrect Jefferson and democracy against Hamilton and financial elites. And FDR writes the only book review he's ever written and decides to reinvent himself as the second coming of Thomas Jefferson. Friends, the only word for this has to be chutzpah, because he's expanding power in the New Deal more than, it would have made even Hamilton blush, but he views himself as the patron saint of Jefferson and democracy rather than limited government. And he puts Jefferson on the nickel, and he builds the Jefferson Memorial. A side note here, if I may. Today, friends, was the last day in American history that the penny has been minted. The last penny was, exactly, in Philadelphia after 232 years, because it costs 3 cents to make a penny, and it's not, more than it is worth. But the nickel may be next, and Jefferson was put on the nickel by FDR, and nickels cost 11 cents to make, so we may lose Jefferson from the nickel, but FDR gave us the Jefferson nickel. And he builds the Jefferson Memorial, and his last speech on the day he dies is going to be given on Jefferson's birthday, praising Jefferson. Then, we're nearly there, Ronald Reagan says that he left the Democratic Party in 1960 because it had abandoned the limited government principles of Thomas Jefferson. And he resolves to reinvent the Republicans as the party of Jefferson and enumerated power rather than Jefferson and democracy. And it's during the Reagan administration that we have the unitary executive theory, which says that the president should be able to deploy executive power vigorously to shrink the post-New Deal administrative state. And all of our current debates on the Supreme Court and in politics involve this question. Is the unitary executive theory true to Hamilton, as the Chief Justice Roberts suggests when he quotes Hamilton in the Trump immunity decision, or is it a distortion of founding era history, turning the president into the very king that the founders feared? And the final bit of pop culture, obviously, is the musical. And Ron Chernow told me during the Liberty Medal that when he decided to write the book in 1988, Hamilton was toast. I mean, he had no constituency, and he was viewed as a kind of aristocrat and exotic. The book transformed him in 2004 when it was published, and then the musical turned him into the rapping champion of the American dream, a multicultural icon for a hip society. I mean, the Caesar and monarch has been replaced by a rapping hipster. So it's just a remarkable tour. I hope that wasn't too much, but it's just
helpful.
a wonderful way to enjoy and appreciate all of American history.
No, thank you so much for giving us that outline, because now we're going to dig into a couple of the moments. But before we do, I mean, you mentioned this at a couple of points. One of the takeaways that I had from this was the incredible impact of books and culture on who is up and down. You would kind of think that it would almost be in reverse, that whoever was up or down would influence culture. And so I'm wondering if you could just, perhaps select an option that you think is particularly noteworthy, or maybe explain why you think that it's happening in this direction as opposed to this sort of the chicken and egg situation.
Well, both Hamilton and Jefferson are obviously protean figures. That was a phrase that Merrill Peterson applied to Jefferson, and they can be invoked and are invoked on both sides of every debate that we have. And you could call that hypocrisy or opportunism, or a kind of grounding of our debates in relatable personalities. We need heroes. These are our heroes throughout American history, and I prefer to be inspired rather than cynical about the fact that both sides are so nimble in invoking one or the other, as the case may be. I mean, there are broad changes in history that shape the debate. You can't have Jefferson and resistance to federal power right after the Civil War, and it was hard to embrace Hamilton after the crash of '29. So, FDR took advantage of the book rather than the other way around, and for the New Deal, it was helpful to paint Jefferson as the prophet of democracy, the democratic aristocrat. That's just as FDR saw himself. But it does suggest that it's good for politicians to root their arguments in these founding era debates. And it's the rare occasions when our debates have become unrooted from both of them that the shooting begins. That's why Calhoun's decision that the Declaration was a self-evident lie is one of those efforts to break up with the founders that shows his illiberalism and threat to the American idea. And extremists today who are arguing, both on the left and the right, that we should break up with the founders, or that America was founded on ideology or religion rather than the American idea, are also rejecting the legacy of Hamilton and Jefferson.
One thing that you mentioned, it's a phrase that I think people have probably heard a lot, so I would love to just kind of dig in a little bit to what it means, is Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends. And I think that phrase sort of captures the tension that you describe so well in this book, and why that tension is actually ideal to our story. So can you talk a little bit about that phrase, where it has kind of, maybe repeat where it comes from, and then how it has been used to capture that tension?
It comes from Herbert Crowley's Promise of the American Life. It was actually the book that kind of got me interested in this whole topic. Crowley was the editor of the New Republic magazine. I spent 20 years or more as the legal editor of the New Republic and came across him then. And he was a progressive era historian and journalist, and he called on Theodore Roosevelt to use Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends. As it happens, he didn't actually use those words. That was a later characterization of his argument, but Roosevelt embraced them when he said, I am a Hamiltonian with regard to my views on federal power, and a Jeffersonian with regard to my views on democracy. The idea was that Hamilton got right a vigorous federal government, but Jefferson was right about democracy and the need for national majorities ultimately to rule. So it was nationalizing Jefferson and democratizing Hamilton. And the particular goals in the progressive era were curbing the corporations and the trusts. Although all three candidates in 1912 disagree about how to do that. Theodore Roosevelt wants to have a Hamiltonian Bureau of Corporations that will regulate the trust from above. Wilson, who's ultimately a Jeffersonian on federal power, inspired by his advisor Louis Brandeis, wants to break up the trust so they can be regulated by the states. And William Howard Taft, the old Judicial Review guy, wants to have vigorous antitrust laws against the trust. You see the complexity, but also the clarity of the different provisions about whether or not it's a good idea to use strong federal power to achieve these populist economic ends. And Hamilton and Jefferson are being deployed in all different directions. So, and the New Deal is a similar debate. The first New Deal breathed the spirit of Hamilton and said Arthur Schlesinger, and the second New Deal of Jefferson and Brandeis. And after the Supreme Court struck down the first New Deal for being too centralizing, the second New Deal came up with the more decentralized regulatory agencies that would have been more consistent with Jefferson. And in fact, our debate, the central debate on the Supreme Court this term on executive power is both the tariffs, a Hamiltonian invention, that's another Hamilton-Jefferson debate, but also the constitutionality of independent agencies. And it was Justice Brandeis who devised the complicated decentralized Federal Reserve and Federal Trade Commission, a combination of public and private authority. And then Brandeis writes the opinion on the Supreme Court in the Humphreys Executor case in 1930, a unanimous Supreme Court opinion, unanimous, upholding the constitutionality of independent agencies on the grounds that Jefferson would have approved, and the point of the Constitution isn't efficiency but liberty. That was Brandeis's amazing phrase. By contrast, the justices who seem inclined to overturn Humphrey's executor, as the court seems inclined to do, are invoking a unitary executive theory that they ascribed to Hamilton, who used a version of it in his Pacificus letters. But there's a very rich and interesting debate about whether this is made up framing era history, and in fact, Hamilton favored administrative state with independent agencies. There's some great briefs filed before the Supreme Court in this case, saying that the original understanding of Hamilton and Jefferson both would have approved of agencies. So the history is great. You see how it's both relevant for understanding American politics, but also our constitutional history and the debates on the Supreme Court. And if that...
I want to dig into that one statement you made, because we often think of Jefferson and Hamilton, we think of political history. And as we're talking about these legal battles, we're talking about constitutional history. But you make a really compelling argument that this debate actually explains everything, explains all types of history. So could you explain that?
Constitutional history, political history, intellectual history, economic history, and social history are all framed with reference to Hamilton and Jefferson by name. It's such an exciting time to study history. I just did word searches of all the primary text and put in the words Hamilton and Jefferson, and they're everywhere. They're invoked on all sides, but they frame each of these debates. So we've talked about the intellectual history, the golden and silver threads. Then talk about the political history. Our first political historians, as it happens, are presidents. John Quincy Adams ascribes the rise of Americans' political parties in 1839 to the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson over national power versus states' rights. Then Martin Van Buren, who writes the first political history of the United States. It's so exciting to see what deep historians these presidents are. He attributes the rise of the political parties to the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson on aristocracy versus rule by elites. And then you remember the rest of the crisscrosses in terms of the characterizations of our political history. But then there's the constitutional history. And the central debate, I concluded based on reading the invocations of Hamilton and Jefferson is not between originalism and non-originalism. It's between liberal and strict construction of the Constitution. And in particular, that debate all goes back to the battle over the bank, which we can talk about if that's helpful, and the question of whether, in the case of the battle of the bank, the Constitution should be construed strictly or liberally was the one that divided Hamilton and Jefferson. Is this a good time to tell that story?
Yes, although I'm going to ask you to do so briefly because there are so many fantastic questions and we are running tragically short on time.
Not at all. Just as quickly as possible, the government's up and running. Hamilton's centerpiece of his financial program is the Bank of the United States. The question is it good finances and is it constitutional? President Washington, always eager to hear both sides, asked Hamilton and Jefferson to write memos on the subject. Jefferson writes his memo and says, the bank is not constitutional because the Constitution says you can do whatever is necessary and proper, and you have to construe the word necessary to mean absolutely necessary or indispensable to an enumerated end. And if the end isn't enumerated, then there's no power to charter a bank, and a bank isn't necessary to achieve the enumerated powers like taxing. Hamilton disagrees. He stays up all night. He writes 14,000 words in a few days, and he says that the Constitution should be construed liberally and in accordance with implied powers. And because it's not, a bank might be appropriate or conducive to carrying out the enumerated powers of taxing or the general welfare, you can charter a bank. So you see the basic question is, does the power have to be written down, as Jefferson says? And if not, then the means has to be absolutely necessary, or can you imply the power if it's useful to achieve an enumerated end? Washington sides with Hamilton in this case, and so does John Marshall. And when the constitutionality of the bank goes up to the Supreme Court, Marshall has beside him Washington's papers, because Bushrod Washington has given Marshall the papers for the biography Marshall is writing of Washington. And in the papers, Washington sees Hamilton's memo, and he writes into the U.S. report Hamilton's sentence, which he paraphrases into the most famous sentence in constitutional law: let the end be legitimate, then any means that are appropriate for carrying it into account are consistent with the Constitution. And that line, and this question of should you construe the power strictly or liberally, and are powers implied or not, defines the debate over the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise, the constitutionality of Reconstruction, the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act, of the Affordable Care Act, and of the tariffs, and of the voting rights cases that were being heard last year. So it's not confirming your initial point about how there's no single original understanding of the word necessary. There's a basic, essential disagreement from the beginning about whether to construe it liberally or strictly.
What I love about watching Washington's cabinet machinations is that depending on who he wants to have the outcome, he will often give them the opportunity to write second.
Huh.
So he asked Jefferson for his opinion, and then he gives the opinion to Hamilton to basically write his. It's like, writing your rebuttal with your opponent's argument right there in front of you. And he's done so. He did the opposite when he did his first veto over the census. So Washington was a politician, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Amazing, but you were also saying that Washington did sometimes side with Jefferson.
Regularly. I mean, up until Jefferson retired at the end of 1793, it's almost 50-50. And on some days, it's literally Hamilton 1 minute, Jefferson the next, and it looks as though he's trying to go back and forth. I don't think that's actually what he was doing. I think he genuinely was looking for a moderate path between the two, which gets to your point, that he thought he was better by having both interpretations, both perspectives, and trying to find a moderate route in the middle, but we just think that he always sided with Hamilton because Jefferson was such a great propagandist. Okay, Harry has an excellent question. We were just talking about the Supreme Court. Given their varied views of the power of the executive branch, what views did Jefferson and Hamilton have on the Supreme Court and the role it should play?
Oh, it's so important and so much more complicated than I thought, but I'll try to do it fast. The court is the second round of the Hamilton-Jefferson battle. Hamilton dies, and Marshall views himself as Hamilton's lieutenant and successor. And he inscribes into law Hamilton's liberal or broad construction of federal power. And Jefferson views Marshall and the courts as a Federalist redoubt, and he's determined to destroy the Federalist effort to entrench their power. And this plays out over their different roles about the president's ability to defy the court. And Jefferson says that the president doesn't have to obey Supreme Court orders where he has a different constitutional conclusion. And in its most extreme form, this would allow the president openly to defy the court. Madison doesn't go quite this far, but his theory called departmentalism, Nixon thought about invoking it not to turn over the Watergate subpoenas. And Marshall ultimately said the president is amenable to judicial subpoenas, although he brilliantly refused to force the issue in the early republic. So broadly, Jefferson is a strict constructionist who thinks that the president, state courts, and Congress can all come to their own constitutional conclusions. And in the event of a disagreement among them, the people decide. Jefferson's ultimately majoritarian and says the will of the majority must ultimately prevail and thinks there should be a constitutional convention or an election. So in other words, Jefferson does not believe that the Constitution should be strictly construed by supremacist judges who have the last word and that the other branches and states have to bow to. And yet, on the current Supreme Court, most of the justices who are strict constructionists are also judicial supremacists and take a much more robust view of federal judicial power than Jefferson did. He feared and wanted to tame the judiciary, but his successors have exalted it.
Jim has an excellent question. To what extent did slavery drive the debate on central government power, Hamilton, versus decentralized state-led power, Jefferson?
Completely. It led it completely, not in the initial framing of the Constitution, because although the central debate at the convention wasn't the ending of slavery, but the resolution by South Carolina and Georgia to want to extend the international slave trade, even though all the other enslaving states wanted to end it. And it wasn't until they did a deal that extended the trade till 1808 in exchange for New England getting navigation acts. It was a deal between South Carolina and Connecticut. Then the South and the enslavers are willing to embrace strong national power, including to preserve slavery. And the Fugitive Slave Clause, which requires the return of escaped slaves, is in the name of the Hamiltonian vision of the Fugitive Slave Clause. So there's no correlation at the beginning between states' rights and slaveocracy. But then the enslavers, and John Calhoun is the leader of that second generation, are going every which way on national power in their frantic effort to preserve the slaveocracy at all times. And that's why Calhoun starts as a nationalist Republican, but then in response to the tariff of the abominations which harms South Carolina, he suddenly invokes Jefferson and nullification, the theory that Jefferson had invoked to resist the Alien and Sedition Acts, and then increasingly insists that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. That is the major issue of the antebellum period. And I know it's complicated, but Jefferson himself ties himself in knots. He initially favors the power to ban slavery in the territories in 1783, a provision that lost by a single vote. Jefferson said the fate of millions turned because the New Jersey delegate didn't show up and there wasn't, and the thing went down. But then Jefferson doubles the size of Louisiana when he becomes president, even though he thinks it's unconstitutional because he just wants to double the size of Louisiana. But then when it comes time to have the Missouri Compromise to restrict slavery, he rediscovers the strict constructionist principles that he'd abandoned in doubling Louisiana and embraces a narrow construction of the Territories Clause of the Constitution. Chief Justice Taney buys that strict construction. Justice Campbell, the old slaveocrat who goes on to be the Secretary of War for the Confederacy, says this proves Jefferson was a hypocrite and he's just shifting his views to preserve slavery. And then after the Civil War, the subversion of Reconstruction and of the clear intention of the Reconstruction Congress is by white resistance to federal authority, and the violence and lynching and mob rule that follows Reconstruction is all because of people waving the banner of Jefferson and the ultimate refusal of the Republicans to continue to send federal power. So we could keep going, but the combination of the slaveocracy and states' rights was a later happenstance. It was convenient, but initially the South wanted federal power to enforce slavery.
Tom asks, Federalist 50 is attributed to Hamilton and Madison. What do you think? Can you point to evidence that would identify the author? And perhaps more importantly, does it matter who it was?
I may be missing it, and you can quickly find out, but many of them are attributed to Hamilton and Madison, but we know who wrote what. It was probably Hamilton because he wrote most of them, but always going to the primary sources, maybe check it out, and I think we can indeed find out. We do know who wrote all of the Federalist Papers, I believe, unless I'm missing something.
Excellent. Donna has asked, would you care to comment on term limits for members of Congress? I'm going to add the Supreme Court here to that, and what Hamilton and Jefferson might think about people serving into their 90s.
Well, we know what they thought about term limits for the president because they took such different views, with Hamilton wanting a life term and Jefferson a one-year term. And Jefferson is generally kind of government by consent, everything at the level of the local shires, and when annual elections end, tyranny begins was the old Whig slogan, and I think Jefferson might have bought that, and Hamilton thinks you need stability and energy and the ability to resist populist pressures, so he generally was more favorable to long terms. When John Adams, another Federalist, read Adam Smith on the human ambition to be admired, he proposed that all terms be hereditary. He was so afraid of democracy when he read that he thought life terms for everybody, for the president and Senate would make sense. Imagine what he would have made of the age of Instagram or X. I mean, the idea of constant approval as the currency of status was his wildest nightmare. But different views on term limits because of their views of federal power. You know, the Supreme Court, Jefferson wasn't a fan of the federal courts. He thought the state courts should be able to ignore federal court decisions they disagreed with. And state judges were elected. So, he might have supported term limits. And as for Congress, Hamilton always wanted longer terms than Jefferson did.
Terry asks, can you share with this audience your habit of reading the great thinkers and philosophers very early in the morning and what it has meant to you?
I mean, thank you for asking. And I know it's ridiculous that I wrote this book fast, and I still can't believe I did it, but it's only because of this new habit. It's just the little life hack that I shared with some of you when I was here last for the happiness book. And I described how I had fallen out of the habit of daily reading, and I'm addicted to my screens, and I'd just been browsing and emailing and the rest of it. But then I spent this unusual year reading the moral philosophy that inspired the founders. I was inspired by a reading list to do it, and just struck by the fact that I hadn't read any of the authors on it, and because we all had more time. I spent a year reading Cicero and Seneca, and I'm waking up early and watching the sunrise and writing weird sonnets, which I'd never done before. And the takeaway for me, though, is I'm not getting up 2 hours before dawn anymore, and I'm not reading moral philosophy every morning, but my new rule is that I have to read before I can browse or surf. And I do read on a Kindle. It just blows my mind that all the books in the world are right here. And it's a daily struggle. Every morning I wake up and I want to check email, but now that I've become a virtue monger and an evangelist for reading, I know I've got to do my reading because I sure feel silly not doing it. So this morning, my wife Lauren and I are reading William James's Washington Square for a book club, so I read some of Washington Square. And the rule is just a half hour or an hour before you're allowed to do anything else. And it really has changed my life. I just did this with a little reading and writing every day, and it's got to be steady. And you can do it in a year, and all the sources are online. And mostly, you just feel eager to wake up and learn something. It's such a marvelous time to be alive when all the books in the world are right here, and there's so much to learn, and it's such a solace and a sort of enclave of light with all the challenges of polarization and the violence. And I think of Hamilton and Jefferson reading until the end, and Jefferson and Adams discussing the books they read and their eagerness to trade ideas about the ancient Eastern and Western philosophies. And my takeaway from reading in this book is it's so inspiring to see what deep readers our presidents were. So listen to this incredible line of presidents who are readers. I told you about Quincy Adams and Van Buren, who wrote political histories of the parties based on their reading of the primary texts of Hamilton and Jefferson. James Garfield reads Hamilton in the law library. Theodore Roosevelt, in addition to writing about Gouverneur Morris, sends the President of Columbia a list of 122 books he's read in his first weeks in the White House, half of them in French. It's unbelievable. It's so inspiring. And he would take those books on safari, wrapped in leather, special cases, so that he could keep reading while he's shooting elephants and getting malaria. That's how much and he wrote a biography of Gouverneur Morris on the side. I mean, it's amazing how much you can do if you read. And then, let's keep going. Coolidge was a reader. FDR collects stamps and deep reads. Harry Truman is such an autodidact. He reads the complete works of Jefferson, which he discusses with Justice Hugo Black, another self-taught Jeffersonian, and burns a hole in his pillow when he goes to bed because he leaves the lamp on because he's reading all night. It's amazing. It's so inspiring. So inspiring. He can quote the letters from memory. And he said he was too busy reading as a kid to get in trouble because he was constantly reading. JFK may not have written all of Profiles in Courage, but he was a historian, and he came up with the best line about Jefferson of anyone. As you know, in the White House, he said of the Nobel Prize winners, the greatest semblance of genius in the White House since Thomas Jefferson died alone. But that's based on his reading. Then quickly to the modern era. Nixon. I may not be educated, but I do read books, he said. And he was a great reader and could carefully describe Jefferson's thinking about defying John Marshall's subpoenas, which he rejected ultimately based on his reading of history. Jimmy Carter read and wrote a lot of history. William Jefferson Clinton drives from Monticello on a bus for his first inaugural to pay tribute to his hero, Thomas Jefferson. George W. Bush read the Chernow biography and recommended it and is a deep reader of history. And finally, President Obama, in addition to debuting the musical at the White House Poetry Jam, read Hamilton so closely that he invoked him in his Cooper Union speech as the patron saint of healthcare reform. So for me, I'm inspired to read, I was just as by Jefferson's reading list, by just seeing not only the passion with which our presidents, our leaders have read, but the fact that they kept it up until their old age, and that for all of them it was a habit. It was just something that they did. And I have to share that we are facing a grave threat to the Republic because people aren't reading. It's a very serious threat, and it's not just the less privileged among us, it's the most privileged, and because we're also distracted by our screens. And you're obviously readers because you've come here and you love Mount Vernon and you're fellow history lovers, but it is very important for each of us to keep up our reading so that we can set an example and share it with our kids. And we have so many challenges of the technology, and AI is about to explode. And literally, these presidents believed that they had to do deep reading of the primary sources or the Republic would fall. And you can't just have an AI summarize it for you. You've got to work through it yourself. So if there's any bright light, this is not a clean or simple story. American history is deeply complicated, and the threads are always crossing and twisting and turning. But they're sustained by this commitment to learning about the American idea and this really deep sense that unless we learn from the past, we will fall the way of Greece and Rome. We'll lose everything we've gained. So that's why I'm reading, and I hope you will too.
So yes, clap. Very good. So this is the second of 3 books. It is a trilogy. The third will be The Pursuit of Union. When will you be visiting us with that one? And why was it important for you to do all 3?
When will I delight you? Well, the main incentive to do it is to come back to Mount Vernon, which is
Obviously.
my favorite place.
Obviously.
And you've got to come as well, I hope. I'm not going to crank that one out too fast. We have a lot of work to do together for America 250 too. But pretty soon. And it didn't start off as a trilogy, but I thought it's going to be so exciting to tell the story of the Constitutional Convention through the forgotten founders who were most influential. When you look at who spoke most frequently at the convention, the guy who spoke most was, wait for it, Gouverneur Morris. So we have to have Gouverneur Morris, then Madison, but then three other guys I hadn't heard so much about. James Wilson, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and John Rutledge, the enslaver. And the stories are so riveting that bringing their forgotten stories to life and showing how their competing ideas of union defined America is going to be so much fun.
Well, of course, standing invitation to return back with that book. I will expect all of you to be present, of course. Dan, I'm sorry, you will have to wait for your other Gouverneur Morris anecdotes for when he does come back, because we are unfortunately out of time. But I want to just close by saying I lied. There was a third thing that the founders agreed upon, which was the importance of an educated citizenry. Yeah. That a republic does not work if citizens are not educated. And you spoke so eloquently about the importance of reading, and you all clapped for it, which means you're all going to go buy the book, right? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. So my plea, as always, is that Mount Vernon is technically a small business, and so we so appreciate your book dollars. This book is exquisitely written. It is so compelling, and tracing the story of Jefferson and Hamilton is a story that a book that I wish I had written. So it's always nice when you get to read it and you're like, oh man, that's a really good idea. I wish I had done that. And of course, Jeff will be here to sign books and to talk with you all. So I am going to ask you, after we give him a round of applause, to allow me to sneak him up and out so that he can get to the table for you all. But thank you all for being here. We hope you'll see you again soon. And please join me in thanking Jeffrey Rosen.
Thank you.
Okay.